Many thanks to Laura, who said yes when I asked her, even though any second now her daughter is having a baby. So, so really thrilled to have her here. Laura has been a mentor in many ways, starting when I was a very young artist and reaching out to Laura for some advice. So it's been really great to share this journey with Laura over the years, and now to have a chance to talk about it. And what better person than Laura Rosenbaum? So thank you, Laura.
Oh, well, thank you, Audrey. I probably have to return the compliment because I will say in my artist life, it's really great having artist friends in other cities and art communities. And so when you come up with artist dilemma or all those things, it's nice to have somebody to call and say, well, what do you think about this, or what, how, look at this and tell me what you think. So Audrey and I have developed that kind of friendship over about 30 years, I think. Yeah, and it's always great when she's in town, and she always stays with us, and that kind of thing. So it's wonderful to have her beautiful work here and let you see it. And I'm so excited because, as I'll mention later, this upcoming museum at the Torrance Museum in LA is about AI, and there's some real heavy hitters in it that I know, and I think this is a terrific opportunity, maybe last chance before she totally explodes on the national scene. Anyway, so first, before we get into talking about your beautiful paintings, I think that maybe we should find out a little bit about you personally. And now, when we first met, I just always called you Audrey Welch, but lately I know that Tulimiero is, did I say it right? I'm always saying it wrong, but it has a interesting story and your background and what that has to do with the materials you use. And I just wanted to sort of start there as a little introduction to you.
Sure. So my maternal family is Sicilian, and it's not the Tulimiero. Tulimiero is my dad's, and he's from Naples. He'll always say he's northern Italian, but it's not very far.
Okay.
It's not far north. But the Sicilian part was a much stronger part growing up. My mom has 4 sisters, and we all lived near each other, and it was one of those very immigrant type situations where families stuck together, we did everything together, and it was about surviving as a group rather than individual. So it was all about supporting each other with work, with just the day-to-day life. And my grandfather was a character. He was a plasterer, a mason from Sicily, and I grew up just watching him, like, covered with plaster. His truck was covered with plaster. He'd take us on these little outings. And I use plaster in my work. And when I started using it as a material, the connection was like, oh yeah, like it's just in my genetic makeup, I think. But I use plaster as a way, and we can talk about this, of concealing. It's like a skin, and it quiets down my surfaces. But underneath the plaster, there's a lot going on. So there's taping, there's masking, there's collage, there's photographic elements, and they get excavated through. So, so I'd say it was, I think now too, the impact of my more immigrant cultural upbringing is impacting some of the emotive quality in the work, the color choices in the work. And there's a couple paintings, like that one's titled My Aunties, and it's specifically related to one in particular aunt who's very loud, boisterous, and was a great sport to me when my mother died. So yeah, so I think it's that Italian culture of family gathering, food, loud, chaotic, that kind of energy and environment. It's playing out in the work, and there is a turbulence, and I think it started quite early in my.
Well, speaking of joy and that influence of going out in nature, one of the things we have in common is taking walks every day and being in nature and observing. And and interesting, as you were staying here, you even on your own found a walk that I like to go on just yesterday. And I think it kind of feeds you. And I think even though these are abstract paintings, there's a lot of nature in them. And do you want to speak to that at all about?
Yeah, you know how we all have to write artist statements and things, and I've been trying to find a way to just say, like, walking is everything. It all happens for me in walking. I wrote my graduate thesis walking and talking into a microphone because there's something about walking, especially when you're walking a little bit longer. I think the mind settles, something opens up, and ideas start popping. So there's something about walking, I think, that's very inherent the process that I work. Nature and trees. I made an observation in my childhood landscape on the East Coast. You've got trees and a lot of these vines in these sort of woodlands. And I realized that there was the curve of the vine and the linear structure of the tree, and just that simple putting together, juxtaposing the gesture and the more geometric line was something I'm very attracted to. And that plays a lot of the work here. You've got the taped, and I use tape a lot to get that linear structure. And then there's a fluid gesture, and it could be the fluid brushstroke of paint, but also a frenetic gesture that I draw with. And so I'm juxtaposing those two elements. So nature absolutely is here in the work. But because it's abstraction, I think primarily it's also an interior response. It's an emotive response to what I'm experiencing, feeling, and observing.
Well, how about the pathways and the roadways? Because uh, those are the things that take you places, and because of your travels, uh, what about those things?
Yeah. So the linear elements actually come from maps, and I looked. It started happening in let's see, Chris, when did we first? In 2002, when we left for Indonesia. And growing up in New Jersey, I thought I would be born in New Jersey, die in New Jersey, and that would be it. And I'd be surrounded by my Italian family. And then I met this guy. But and life took me on a different tack. So when we lived in Indonesia, and then we lived in each location 5 years, I began to look at maps of where I lived as a way to assimilate myself in that place, because place was important. Place was important growing up. It identified me. So I started looking at maps and realized not only did I like seeing where I was in the big picture of things, but I enjoyed the linear diagram of the maps. They were like drawings. So I would take these maps and I'd actually use the composition of the map in the work. So this is actually the map that I was looking at was a map of Damascus. Doesn't have anything really to do too much with the subject of this piece, but it's a map. I keep a big folder of maps that I'm interested in, and so I go through them, and if something reaches out, and sometimes the map is specific to a place that I'm trying to sort of conjure a memory of or a color of or something. So that's where the linear tracks kind of are coming from. And I'm blowing them up a little bit in this work where I'm not as, before the linear structure of the map stayed very much on the top surface and it would be like the last move of the piece, the last layer. And now I'm sort of painting on top of them and I'm pushing them further back in space and allowing them to go forward and backwards more.
Yeah, well, the maps, the pathways, all of that. I think that what I'm interested in, that one thing that I'm always amazed about your work is that we use, as painters, I'm a figurative painter, you're an abstract painter, but we use a lot of the same painting techniques, and I'm always interested in that. And I think it's interesting that you started out with figuration, and I'd like to go a little bit into your background to just sort of hear where that came from, because I think as abstract paintings, these have spatial depth and they work very much as a realist or a figurative painter might work to give it depth. And I think you had some really good influences. And so, one, maybe you should tell us where you studied, where you lived, and the influence of what you saw and the people. There's some.
University of Delaware, where I got my BFA, was pretty generic, I'd say, in a BFA program. There was nothing too spectacular, but just your good foundational work in design, drawing from the figure a lot, painting, a lot of still life drawing and painting. But it was after I graduated, and I had a little stint at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Any artists here know about that place. Thomas Aiken studied there. And you have to start off by drawing the plaster casts before you can actually draw from the body, from the model. So it was very, very classical. It really slowed you way down. It was really training your eye. And it was all really very much about tone. And I think I'm a tonal painter. I don't think color and value, I should say value. Because when you're drawing from the model and figure, you're using charcoal usually, and you're looking at all the dark light variations, right? So it was a short stint at PAFA, but then I ended up back in New York, and I got to study at the Art Students League for a couple of years. And that was again, just like real solid teaching and foundational about looking at the figure model after model. At PAFA, I met a Russian immigrant. He was a professor there, Mark Leonsky. And Mark and his daughter, we got to be friendly. He had a beautiful studio on Prince Street, New York City. And I boldly asked him, can I study with you, you know? And so his idea of that was I would show up and I would need to be very quiet and watch him. It was about watching him. And then he gave me an assignment, and I had to copy a Velasquez portrait. And I would and then he said, bring it back. And he told me, just do it in charcoal. So I'd bring it back, and it was always no. And then he'd show me what I needed to work on. And I did that 10 times. Wow. He was just like, but he took me to the Met a couple times, and we walked in, we paid our quarter, you could pay a quarter then, and he took me to a Cezanne painting, and he wanted me to look at the color white of the tablecloth. And he was trying to show me that within white, there is a multitude of color. And we went and we looked at the Cezanne for quite a while, and we left. And I was hoping we were going to look at other things, but that was it. That was the lesson. But I'm sharing this because it really opened my eyes. We looked a lot at the Renaissance painters, Piero della Francesco, Titian, Rubens. Those are really artists I continue to look at. Caravaggio, especially Caravaggio, for those sharp contrasts with the composition, those dynamic compositions. And I think more than landscape, this work may be more figurative informed, to be honest.
I knew it.
I think so. Yeah.
Well,
you can't, that curve, anybody who's done a lot of figure drawing and gesture drawing, that curve of the figure, right? And the head, the portrait. Sometimes I think I'm painting heads sometimes. I mean, not in a literal way, but there's something about the structure that's more figurative, I think, than landscape. Except for maybe that piece.
We have things to say about that later too. But
so I hope that makes sense.
Well, we should talk about the turbulence too. But this brings up for me listening to you. When you're working, do you have moments that are a little more quiet and thought out, maybe as you put the tape down, or I don't know what those moments are, versus moments that are more turbulent, perhaps that you're moving and paying attention to your music? Or tell us how you work. Just lead us through work
Yeah,
session?
I think the one way I work is I keep this big, I call it my atlas, and layering, as you can kind of get the sense from the work, the layer, it's all about the layers. So I began to try to get a little more methodical, because you know how sometimes you might do a piece and you go, how did I do that? Like you're trying to recall it. And I thought, well, just write it down. So I just started writing down like an ingredients in a recipe, just started writing down the layers. So it could be something like graphite drawing, ballpoint pen, taping, paint, masking fluid, photographic transfer. It can go on, and what was fun is I began to see in the layers I could shift the layers. So if I was taping as the third step, I could try taping as the first step and move it around a little. So that kind of thinking or strategizing is calming in a way, because you're trying to put some structure into something that's quite intuitive and quite you really are entering the unknown many times in my process, where you know you get more into the flow and you start picking up the materials and working, and you sort of enter this place where your thinking mind goes away and you just are responding to what's in front of you. But there's other times where it's really important that the thinking mind is taking a little is taking over. So that's where
Sounds right and left brain to me.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that you go back and
And I
forth.
think taping has become like drawing for me in a funny way, because I cut my tape in different lengths. It's sort of meditative, and then laying it on is like drawing, and it's a slower part of the process. It slows me down. I do a lot of sitting and looking. That slows me down because sometimes a piece needs to talk to you a little bit. Like it's responding, and you need to listen. Um, and it's going to take as long as it's going to take what it takes.
Sometimes your marks just seem like they with the paint and the strokes and the plaster particularly, and what I want to find out about your tools too, but uh, that you don't want to reveal. Sometimes there's been some interesting history that you really want to bring to the front that you reveal. Sometimes it seems to me that you're concealing, so it's kind of the revealing, concealing, and the history. It's a markage of time in a way, and some of the marks. Okay, I have to say, just compositionally, having done, compositional. Sometimes the marks will bring a color to another part of the canvas that really helps balance it, or brings it to an edge that gives it weight, even though it's a small mark. And sometimes you do that with tape, and sometimes you do that with paint. And and to me, I want to get into color next, because I think the emotive part of your painting is conveyed through the color. And I think, to me, you're bringing, I would call it emotions, or the certain type of energy that color and emotions can create. You're bringing it to the fore, or you're concealing it. And I think, especially when you use the white, the plaster and the white, and it covers and allows the bleeds through. That's some of the most interesting parts, I think, of what's the history and what you build on. So I think that's kind of what I was getting to. If it's done intuitively, if you're thinking about it, if it goes that right left brain back and forth, that you
Yeah, working with the taping and burying a lot of elements is like painting backwards, because you don't see the end until the end, right? You're not seeing how is all, because imagine like I've got a lot of color going on underneath a ground. I'll put some taping, which is a masking, it's covering something. And then I use a liquid masking fluid sometimes. to create a rounder pour. And then I might cover the whole thing with plaster. And then the scary part is, as I pull through, I have no idea how those colors and compositions are going to work with what's already on the surface. So it is, and it's that element of surprise, I think, that I find super exciting.
So you're in charge, and then let the painting be in charge, and it's a back and forth. You're having a tug of war. Okay, well, I've got to pin you on this because you're not getting to it, but I want you to talk color and the emotive. Yeah.
Color, like I said, I think I approach the work much more with values. So I'm not a colorist naturally, I don't feel. And I feel color, I have to work a little harder with color. So what I do is I sort of have like a color little dictionary where I keep palettes of colors that I like. So oddly, this palette, which is like red, yellow, magenta, umber, comes from a rug, a photograph I saw of a rug. And I just love these colors. And so I just tape it in this book, right? We lived in Thailand. The monks wear an orange, beautiful saffron robe. That color became kind of embedded in my retina, and it showed up in my paintings a lot. So I'll photograph. There's a wall I saw in Australia that was a beautiful coral color that had grays and a dark umber, and that became a palette for a lot of paintings. And then once I find a palette, I like exploring it through a lot of paintings to see how I really want to work and what colors want to get accentuated. So that palette and that palette, it's the same palette in all of those paintings. You know, it's the same palette in that painting. It's just different elements get emphasized. So I don't think I'm a colorist by nature, and I think much more in balance.
Yeah, and I think that's what's important, and I do think that's what you learned by all your training and all those years with the figure, because, you know, as I tell my students, if you can hit the composition and match the values in darkness and light as if it was grayscale, you know, no color, if you can get it to work with the depth, and then you can match that value with any color you want as long as it works in the dark and light. And that's what I find so interesting about your work, is it has that. It, you know, you take a photograph of it and it's still going to be a great composition if we reproduced it in black and white, you know, and then you give us these shots of color. And I think because maybe it's the monks, or maybe you've lived in places where they're not afraid of color and they just shout it out. But you're not afraid to shout it out, I think, because really the plaster has a subdued, subtle, and so it is, to me, speaks of somebody that's well traveled in both emotionally, life experience, and different parts of your geography, in that maybe if you stayed in one place and hadn't had those things, you'd embrace just sort of the more somber tones, but you allow the shout in there, which kind of really, I think, jazzes them and gives it an edge. One thing before I let you ask questions, that is sort of something I use in my own painting, something I teach my students that you just do intuitively. I think we've talked about it before. You have when you introduce a color like red, like in the antique painting, you have different types of red: warms, cools, red mixes, but they're all the reds. Whereas that yellow is pretty consistently the same yellow. So we really notice the different bleeds of reds. And one thing you're really good at, which I don't think, you know, I love it in your work, is, and I really think I saw this first in your work after, or during, and after Indonesia, was the blues and that green, that sort of green that's just starting to come out, that really spring green. So the warm acidic green, you know, working with the blues. So you have the warms and the cool blues. I love that. And then one of my favorite things is that you will put your darks over lights and your lights over darks, and then also mix them. And then you run the light into another light or something of the same value, or the dark into a dark or something of the same value. So again, it's a depth thing, but you do it with color, and I think that's one of the strengths of your work that makes it particularly exciting. Okay, yeah. Are there some questions or insights?
Yeah, Craig.
It sounds like a lot of your process is a kind of a improvisational dialogue with the emergent piece. To what extent, or what is your process of planning and sketching?
So that's a great question. Thanks. One of my favorite painters is Charlene Von Hell. She's a New York-based painter, and I was looking at a show she had recently, and she does these very large canvases. But she had a wall of these smaller pieces, and then I heard her talking, and she said they were like her studies. They were like her sketches, and she just had them laying around. And I thought, for this show, I'm going to do the same thing. So I ordered these 16 by 20s, and I had a big stack of them. And what I tried to do is, when I had an idea, when I wanted to experiment with some new markers or a line, or experiment with different color combinations, it's like, just get it down on a small piece, and just let it, and be okay with that. You can do a fast painting. I need to keep telling myself, you can do a fast painting. Every painting doesn't have to have the labor that, I don't know, is ingrained in me. There's something about labor. Like, there has to be months of sweat and labor for something to be valuable. And then the bigger it is, the more valuable it is. So I think those are really good things to challenge, right? A more intimate piece can be just as dynamic in scale and power than a large piece, right? So anyway, so those became like my sketches of trying out new things, and maybe exploring some things that might trigger where I want to go next. So I think, yes, I do think sometimes when the subject of the piece becomes clear, that it does dictate the moves more. And you do have to abandon, so many times you do have to abandon what you thought was a great idea. Yeah. And you try it, and then you realize, oh no, like many times I pull all the tape and the masking fluid and the vinyl, and I look at it and I'm like, ooh, yeah, no, like it's not, you know, it has a journey to go yet, you know. So, and I think those subjects, the meaning of the work, maybe some of you relate to this, that it sometimes it evolves after, or right towards the end of something. And it's when you're sitting back and looking at it and going, oh.
Yeah, that's the moment, right? Almost like epiphany, where you say, now I get it.
And sometimes how one relates to the other one. Like, I love when something is having a conversation. Like, I really, in the studio, I had that one next to that one, and they're like opposite sisters, right? They're like the two most opposite people you can meet. And there they are trying to have a relationship, you know? And I think I'm getting bolder about letting those two be. Because rather than trying to let everything be this, right? Or everything be that. So, because I think there's those different parts of my practice that I want to be. Yeah. And I think I know this work isn't just for me, right? I'm not doing this just for me. And it's getting them out in the world, getting them seen.
It completes the painting. It's the sort of end process.
You complete the painting,
yeah.
Like by looking and bringing, you know, that's the part of it. It goes back to the looking, right? what you bring to it, what your eyes see.
Or what they, I always think when paintings find a home, they've resonated with something that you've shown them, and so it becomes universal at that point because everyone's experience is different. But when it starts to resonate and it means something to the owner, the new owner.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing I really like about these is they have this incredible sense of expansion. They could just all keep on going, and they go both directions, which is a really tough thing to do. And when you look at them first, you think, oh, they're broken. But then the more you look at them, you realize they're just they're showing you part of this energetic web. And so I know you've touched on the concept of labyrinths and how those work in Still Point. Do you have like an underlying spiritual practice that you do that's part of your studio practice and part of making these?
That's a great question.
That's a good question. So in the Italian-American milieu, I was exposed at a very young age to Catholicism and the rituals of the Mass and the incense. And I think those early experiences certainly impacted me in two ways. That ritual was important, and that there was a certain time. This was a different time than the everyday, and that a sense of that there was something bigger, greater than myself. So those were two things that have carried into my life. And yes, I think prayer, meditation, that time of stillness each day is vital to the practice. Yeah, to that, creating that space. And I think in the end, I hope the work somehow is healing. Somehow. That there's a quality of transformation. It's a tough word, but regeneration that I experience. So out of struggle, out of conflict, can arise.
Yeah. There's a lot of wholeness and balance and light and clarity out of a lot of mark making and process.
Yeah.
So I think that does model that kind of energetic quality in these. It's very beautiful and very healing.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Are you able to stick around for a little bit?
Yes.
Or want to have other questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.